Texture is a word that you probably know to mean how something feels when you touch it. So you might have a smooth texture or a rough texture. Now in music, we have the same thing, only we're not talking about how something feels to touch. We're talking about how something feels to listen to. Think about two different scenes. The first scene, you've got a man on his own looking out on a landscape. The other scene is of a crowded, busy city street. Now the music that you'd use to represent these two scenes would be very different. In the first, you probably have a very thin, simple texture, whereas in the music for the city street, you'd want lots of sounds going on at once. So that's essentially it. It's how the music feels. You've got three different types of texture. The first is monophonic, then you've got homophonic and polyphonic. So that's monophonic, homophonic and polyphonic. Monophonic literally means one sound, and it's used to describe just a single melody on its own. Now that doesn't necessarily mean just one instrument. You might have 100 instruments all playing the same thing, and if they're playing the same notes at the same time, then it's monophonic. Now, the earliest music to be written down in a notated form was early church music. It was chanting, and this was all monophonic, just singing one melody line on its own. Homophony literally means same sound, and it's when you've got multiple parts coming together to form harmony. Often one of those parts will be a melody and then the other parts will be an accompaniment in harmony with that melody. In this example, we can see four singers all singing different pitches at once. And when they sing together, you get chords or harmony, and this is homophonic. Now, the majority of all popular music is homophonic, where you've got a melody with chords. Here's an example here. This is a song by Adele called Hello. So you've got these chords first of all, and then the melody. So together that forms a homophonic texture, and it's melody dominated. And then finally, the third kind of texture is polyphonic. Now, polyphony literally means many sounds, and it's the most complex of all the textures. It's where you've got several melodies all coming together, interweaving independently. This really comes into its own in the Baroque era, where you've got composers like Bach really experimenting with polyphony and making really complex arrangements. Here's one example by Bach. It's a fugue in B flat. So as you can hear, hopefully, it starts with a single melody line, and this would be monophonic just for the first 4 bars. And then it brings in that melody again whilst a counter melody is played up here. After that, it brings a third melody. Okay, and it carries on. So it gets very, very complex. And this really kind of grew out of fashion a little bit at the end of Baroque period into the classical, where they tried to make things more simple. Some other textures then, you've got call and response, which is where you've got one instrument or voice being played and then a whole group responding. Antiphony, which is where you've got dialoguing, kind of speaking, but it's almost like a conversation between two different groups of instruments or voices. Imitation comes up a lot, where you have a melody played in one part, which is then copied in another part. And octave doubling, this is where you'll have a melody, and instead of just playing it in one octave, it will be doubled in another octave, either by another instrument or by the same instrument. So, for example, you might have, and then doubled. Okay? So how do you describe texture then? Well, the first thing to do is to decide which of those three main textures is it. Is it monophonic, is it homophonic, or polyphonic? Next, does it change at all during the piece? As we heard with the bark there, it was the overwhelming majority of it was polyphonic, but we did have a small section of monophony at the very beginning. So just check, does it change over time and where? Always try and give bar numbers if you can. And then go a bit further, talk about the role of each instrument. So if you've got a string quartet, for example, then you want to describe what instrument is doing. Say the violin has the melody with the viola, bass and cello playing harmony in the background. So that would be homophonic. And finally, you always need to say what effect the texture is having on the music and the purpose for it. And if you think back to our pictures at the beginning, if we had music for a kind of lonely person on their own, it would be very different to the music for a crowded street. And so you always want to think of the purpose of the music and think, how is the texture of the music contributing to that purpose?